In this episode, we shift from what the Certified Information Systems Security Professional represents to how you actually build the kind of durable understanding that performs well on the exam and still feels useful afterward. The mechanics of studying matter because the exam rewards connected reasoning more than scattered familiarity, and the fastest way to waste time is to study in a way that produces recognition without retrieval. Mindset matters just as much because even a strong plan collapses if you study only when you feel motivated or if anxiety turns practice into avoidance. I am going to treat studying like a system you can design, where memory, attention, and decision-making are resources you manage deliberately. When you understand why certain techniques work, you stop guessing and start building momentum that holds through long preparation cycles. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to the CISSP books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Learning sticks best when concepts connect to scenarios and daily decisions, not because you need dramatic stories, but because the brain retains meaning better than isolated definitions. When you learn access control, do not keep it as a vocabulary word floating in space, because it becomes far easier to recall when it is tied to a decision about who should approve a change, who should access data, and what happens when permissions drift. When you learn risk, it becomes stable knowledge when you can picture a threat meeting a weakness and producing impact, which is a decision framework you can reuse across domains. Even when you are not working in a specific environment, you can still anchor concepts to familiar organizational choices like buying versus building, centralizing versus delegating, or preventing versus detecting. The exam tends to present these ideas as judgment calls under constraints, so studying in a way that mirrors decision-making makes recall faster and reasoning more reliable. A key technique here is active recall, which simply means retrieving ideas without prompts, because retrieval is what strengthens memory pathways. Recognition feels good, like when you reread notes and everything seems familiar, but the exam does not ask whether a paragraph looks familiar, it asks whether you can produce the idea under pressure. Active recall is what happens when you explain a concept in your own words, define a term without looking, or outline a process from memory and then check what you missed. This feels harder than passive review, and that discomfort is actually the signal that your brain is doing the work of strengthening access to the knowledge. If you build a habit of testing yourself gently and often, you train the exact skill the exam requires, which is recalling principles and applying them rather than scanning for a remembered phrase. Spaced repetition is the second technique that changes outcomes, because revisiting topics over time reduces forgetting and keeps knowledge available when you need it. If you cram a topic once, you may understand it that day, but understanding in the moment is not the same as being able to retrieve it 2 weeks later in a mixed set of questions. Spaced repetition uses timing as a tool, bringing a concept back right when it is starting to fade, which strengthens retention more efficiently than repeating it many times in one sitting. This is especially important for a broad exam, because you will study many domains, and it is normal for earlier material to weaken while you focus on later material. When you intentionally revisit key concepts at increasing intervals, you create a stable foundation that does not collapse as your coverage expands. Interleaving is another powerful method, and it means mixing topics rather than studying one area in isolation for long stretches, because the exam forces you to discriminate between similar ideas across domains. When you study one topic only, your brain can start answering by pattern recognition, which looks like mastery until the context changes and the cues disappear. Interleaving interrupts that comfort, forcing you to decide which principle applies, which is exactly what happens in exam questions that blend governance, risk, architecture, and operations in the same scenario. This method is also how you learn boundaries, like when a question is really about accountability and decision rights rather than about a specific technical control. It can feel slower at first because you lose the sense of speed that comes from repetition, but what you gain is flexible understanding that transfers across contexts. Cognitive load rises when too many new terms arrive together, and that can quietly sabotage your progress even when you are studying consistently. Cognitive load is the amount of mental effort required to process information, and it spikes when you encounter many unfamiliar terms, new frameworks, and exceptions all at once. When load is high, people often keep reading anyway, but the result is shallow encoding, where nothing sticks and everything feels like it must be relearned later. A better approach is to pace the introduction of new vocabulary, giving yourself time to build simple meanings first and then add nuance and edge cases. If you respect cognitive load, you avoid the cycle where study sessions become exhausting and discouraging, which often leads to long gaps that reset progress. Mental models are the tool that keeps cognitive load manageable because they organize details into a structure you can navigate quickly under time pressure. A mental model is a simple framework that explains how pieces relate, like thinking of risk as a flow from threat and vulnerability to likelihood and impact, which then drives treatment decisions. When you have that structure, new details have a place to attach, and you are not trying to store everything as separate facts competing for attention. Mental models also reduce confusion between similar concepts because you can compare where they sit in the framework rather than memorizing subtle wording differences. This matters for a broad exam because you will repeatedly encounter ideas that overlap, like governance versus management, prevention versus detection, or authentication versus authorization. When your mental models are clear, you spend less energy searching memory and more energy reasoning through the question in front of you. Ambiguous questions reward principle-based reasoning, not memorized lists, and this is one of the most important mindset shifts for this exam. Ambiguity here does not mean unfairness. It means the question is designed to test whether you understand priorities, constraints, and intent, rather than whether you can recite a definition. When multiple answers sound plausible, the exam is often asking what you would do first, what best supports governance, or what best reduces risk at the program level, and those are judgment questions. Memorized lists can help you recall categories, but lists do not decide trade-offs for you, and trade-offs are where the exam lives. If you train yourself to ask what principle the question is testing, you reduce confusion and avoid chasing distractor answers that contain familiar keywords but violate the underlying intent. That principle-based approach also keeps you steady when you encounter questions that feel oddly worded because you can lean on reasoning instead of panic. The resources people use differ widely, and each type supports a different part of learning, so it helps to understand what each is good for rather than treating them as interchangeable. Outlines are strong for coverage because they show you the scope and the relationships among topics, which helps you avoid blind spots. Question banks are strong for retrieval practice and for learning how concepts are tested, but they can also create false confidence if you memorize patterns instead of building understanding. Audio reviews are useful for reinforcement and for building familiarity with terms and relationships, especially when you want exposure that fits into busy schedules. Books are useful for depth and coherence because they can explain why the concepts matter and how they connect, which is essential for principle-based reasoning. The right combination depends on your starting point, but the underlying goal is always the same. Build understanding that you can retrieve and apply under time constraints. Practice questions reveal gaps, especially in wording and assumptions, and those gaps are often more about interpretation than about missing knowledge. Many people miss questions not because they do not know the topic, but because they misread what the question is asking, misunderstand a constraint, or assume a context that the question did not grant. Practice exposes those habits because it forces a decision, and a forced decision is where hidden misunderstandings become visible. When you review an answer, do not stop at whether it was right or wrong, because the value is in identifying what clue you missed and what assumption you imported. Over time, you start noticing recurring patterns, like questions that are really testing governance sequencing, risk prioritization, or least privilege thinking. That pattern recognition, built from careful review, is what turns practice into improvement rather than just repetition. Confidence improves when errors become categories, not isolated misses, because categories give you a plan, and isolated misses just create frustration. If you treat each wrong answer as a one-off failure, you will feel like the exam is unpredictable, and unpredictability creates anxiety and avoidance. If you instead classify errors, you can see whether the issue is conceptual, like misunderstanding risk treatment, or interpretive, like missing what most likely implies, or strategic, like choosing a technical fix when the question wanted governance. Categories also reveal whether you are weak in a domain area or whether you are weak in question reading, which are very different problems with very different solutions. When you can say, with calm clarity, "I keep missing questions that depend on decision order," you have turned confusion into a target. That is how confidence becomes earned rather than wished for, because you can watch categories shrink as you improve. Mindset matters, and the specific traits that show up most are persistence, patience, and calm under time pressure, because this exam is a long game and it tests judgment. Persistence is the ability to return consistently, even when progress feels slow, because broad knowledge accumulates in layers, and you often do not feel the gain until later. Patience is what keeps you from rushing to advanced material before the foundations are stable, which is a common cause of repeated relearning. Calm under time pressure is not about pretending you are not stressed. It is about maintaining decision quality when the question feels tricky and your brain wants to hurry. You develop calm by practicing the act of slowing down, identifying what is being tested, and selecting the answer that best fits the principle, even when distractors look tempting. The best candidates are not always the fastest, but they are often the most consistent and the most composed when uncertainty appears. Consistency matters because small sessions compound into durable familiarity, and that compounding effect is one of the few advantages you can reliably control. Long sessions feel productive, but they are fragile because life interrupts, fatigue rises, and missed days can create guilt that turns into avoidance. Short, steady sessions build a habit, and habits carry you when motivation dips, which is inevitable in any multi-week or multi-month preparation. Consistency also supports spaced repetition naturally, because you are revisiting material regularly rather than in disconnected bursts. Over time, you start noticing that your brain retrieves concepts faster, that your reading of questions becomes cleaner, and that fewer terms feel unfamiliar, and those are signs of real progress. When consistency is paired with active recall and thoughtful review, you create a preparation system that is resilient, even when your schedule is not. To conclude, the study principles in this episode are not separate tricks. They are a framework for how later topics connect and reinforce as your coverage expands across the domains. When you connect concepts to real decisions, you build meaning that makes retrieval easier, and when you use active recall, you train the exam skill of producing knowledge under pressure. Spaced repetition and interleaving keep that knowledge available and flexible, preventing the common problem of forgetting early domains as you move forward. Managing cognitive load and building mental models lets you learn broadly without drowning in vocabulary, while principle-based reasoning keeps you stable when questions are ambiguous. Resource choice matters, but the deeper driver is how you use those resources to expose gaps, categorize errors, and build calm, consistent progress. If you carry this framework forward, you will find that each new topic has a place to attach, and that is what turns a large exam into a coherent body of knowledge. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.